yes, it is in line with what happened in the Baltic states, but it also has its own particular Hungarian qualities. Now, I call this brief contribution from occupation to occupation, Hungary's brief encounter with democracy 1944-1947. In fact, actually, I will go back a bit further in time, and I will go a bit forward in time. That's the kernel of it. What you have to remember, Hungary was an independent state. Hungary was a German ally during the Second World War, from 1941 onwards, took major losses, around 100,000 casualties, very early in 43 in Voronezh. In exchange, if you like, Hungary received back some of the mostly Hungarian inhabited territories that it had lost under the Treaty of Trianon in 1920. At the same time, Hungary was not a Nazi state. It was constrained to introduce forced labor and other discriminatory measures against Jews. The Jews were not threatened with extermination. Even more remarkably, not many people know this, the Social Democrats were sitting in the Hungarian parliament, the only unique case in wartime occupied Europe, and given wartime conditions, the press remained relatively free. At the same time, clandestine negotiations were taking place with the Allies, and this was a growing source of irritation to the Germans, as you might very well imagine. So in March 1944, they occupied Hungary, they launched the extermination of the Jews that claimed over 500,000 victims, and eventually allowed a Hungarian Nazi regime, the so-called Arab Cross, to take power in October 1944. The Red Army entered Hungary in the same month and began the siege of Budapest in December 1944, and hostilities on Hungarian soil ended in 1945. I'm old enough to remember the siege of Budapest. I was there. There were enormous losses and terrible devastation. Budapest was a heap of smoking ruins. That's a good type of now anymore. Now, the next point I want to make is that the Hungarian communists were really very weak. According to some estimates, in 1945, they may have had about 800 members in a population of about 10 million, roughly. Yet, by 1949, they established monopoly control. They were weak, apart from anything else, because they had the unique distinction of having run the only failed communist regime at that time. I'm referring to the 133 days of the Hungarian Soviet Republic of 1919. So they had to rely very extensively on Soviet backing to achieve their objectives. The Allied Control Commission, which was there till 1947, the peace treaty, was largely run by the Kremlin and was a primary actor in this process. But what I think we can see is the communists' appetite grew with the eating. They began by expecting a major success in the November 1945 elections, which were not completely free and not completely fair, but they did reflect Hungarian opinion, where the communists got 17% and the smallholder party got 57, I think it was, no, sorry, 54. They got an absolute majority. Terrible shock to the communists, as you could well imagine. Coalition government, a four-party coalition government was put in place, 1945. And this is a very strange beast indeed. It was a government which included its own opposition. The communists inside the government grabbed the Ministry of Interior, well, they always did do that, and they did what they could to destabilize the government from within. At the same time, the Communist Party, wherever it could, took control of the machinery of the state and regularly sabotaged the activities of democratic forces, especially the secret police, but other areas as well. And then it should be made clear that the communists had enormous dynamism. They were untouched by the previous regime. They could say, we are the salvation of the country, and they did attract 17% of the vote, which is their best vote ever in Hungary. But that's not enough for absolute monopoly control. And I think it's also true that the perception that only what the communists said and thought had validity took root there. This is relevant for much later on. Why why, you might ask, does the Kremlin allow this experiment in democracy? I hesitated with that word. And the answer, I think, is that Hungary was of secondary significance to the Kremlin, strategically, and probably in 45 there was no definitive decision as to what the fate of Hungary should be. The same was true of Czechoslovakia at that time. By late 1947, the decision was made. It was made clear at the meeting in Szklarska Poręba, it's on the Czech-Polish border, that full communist control in the Stalinist mode was the way forward, backward. This situation was exacerbated for Hungary by the breach with Yugoslavia, with Tito. Hungary was in the front line, and there was a planned invasion of Yugoslavia. This is not very widely known, which would obviously have used Hungarian territory. Oh, and by the way, something very similar was happening in 1999. Hungary had just joined NATO, and if there had been an invasion of Serbia, it would have come from Hungary, but fortunately it didn't happen. One by one, the non-communist parties disappeared. In 1948, the Social Democrats were merged. Again, I use that word in quotes. And they were banned, all other parties were banned, and then the Communist Party itself was purged. Moscow style. Classical, short show trials, torture, confessions, executions, the lot. I think this can be seen as a purification ritual, which carried a message that the party was omnipotent and omniscient, and society should simply accept this. So I would say the brief encounter with democracy was over. Let me take a little more of your time and move on. I'm not going to go into great detail on Stalinization, except to give you one statistic. Between 1952 and 1955, 4 calendar years, 1.1 million people were interrogated by forces of coercion, and 450,000 or so were interned or imprisoned. So this is about 5% of the population. Not very many families were exempt from this. And those that were obviously inside the system. Even that's not true. Now, I've no time to talk about how the 56 revolution came about. What I want to say is that it was revolutionary. It really did launch something that would have been radically new and different, but it would have worked, we don't know, because it was suppressed by December 56. The Red Army returned, with serious fighting for about 10 days. Revolution was suppressed, trials, executions followed, about 500 people, we think. About 250,000 people left Hungary, about 100,000 returned. I want to add here that this is the third communist takeover of Hungary. We Hungarians were a difficult lot, 1919, 1947, and 1956. And by the way, it's the fourth time that a Russian army invaded the country. 1849, let's forget this, 1915, the Russians briefly entered Hungary, 1944 and 1956. So, finally, the revolution failed. But it left a deep mark, because it set up limits for both rulers and ruled. The party was completely traumatized by its collapse during the revolution, and also by the realization that the people were utterly hostile to communism. So Hungarian society, on the other hand, understood that it was powerless against communism as long as the Soviet Union was there and prepared to use the Red Army as it had done in Czechoslovakia in '68. Change only came in the 1980s. We all know Gorbachev signaled that the Red Army would no longer be used. But, finally, the communist mindset lives on. It influences the communist successor party, rebranded as socialists, and note that the way in which the communist successor parties, including the Hungarian party, have been embraced by Western socialist parties mean that they have also embraced a part of the communist past with all its human rights violations, its anti-democratic elements, the lot. But they don't seem very keen on recognizing that this is really not what the Western left should be about.